Assalamualaikum, my name is Arfan and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I will want to share with you a read from the Oxford Study Bible, the Revised English Bible with the Apocrypha, the Oxford Study Bible. This is from page 1263, and this is an entry with regards to the Gospel. And I found this video necessary because recently there has been a comment on my video talking about or discussing about the Gospels, and so I thought I want to read this to you from the Oxford Study Bible. Among the earliest Christians, the word Gospel was not used as the title of a book or as a designation for a class of literature. Okay. I repeat, the word Gospel was not used as a title of a book or as a designation for a class of literature. Instead, it was a term which meant good news, evangelion, and referred to the message of salvation which those Christians proclaimed. Basically means Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whoever these authors were, they wrote the good news. Basically, they wrote down the ministry of Jesus or the sayings of Jesus, okay, according to the Christian tradition. Okay. But again, as I mentioned, whoever these authors are, they are not historical Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. Though some scholars have argued that the literatures do go back to them in a sense whereby there are some, it could be their sayings, it could be their excerpts here and there. But majority of scholars are of the opinion that these are anonymous people because that is where the evidence leads us to. The gospel as proclamation was about Jesus Christ, whose crucifixion and resurrection were at the center of the message, which also included stories about his deeds and reports of his teachings. Yeah, obviously, Muslims do not believe that Jesus was actually crucified, because if you read the Gospel of Matthew, especially after the voice from heaven comes down, after the voice from heaven was heard, yeah, the devils, you can call it the devil, they actually brought Jesus to a high place, okay, and not a single stone will actually prick the foot of Jesus. And this is in the Gospel. And so this is one of the arguments which Muslims have used, whereby if not even a single stone shall prick the foot of Jesus, what about crucifixion? Yeah, and so there's some discrepancies in the biblical narratives there. As the Christian movement grew, a considerable body of tradition about Jesus developed and circulated in the first decades of the church's life. While that tradition was made up of individual units, for example, single stories, independent sayings, there were soon collections and short accounts useful for instruction, liturgy, and other purposes in the church. Between the year 70 and 100 of the Common Era, several authors employed these elements to compose connected narrative accounts which came to be known as Gospels. The title Gospel probably derives from the opening words of one of these narrative documents that are attributed to Mark. For example, the beginning of the Gospel. The title certainly reflects the fact that all of these books focus on Jesus Christ, in whose life, death, and resurrection in the church found the hope of salvation. 4 of these narrative documents are found at the front of the New Testament, where they were collectively identified as the Gospel, and where in ancient manuscripts they were distinguished by the heading according to Matthew. For example, in Greek, katamarkon. Okay. According to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John. Katamarkon, kata Lukan, kata Yohanan. Scholarly opinion varies about the type of literature to which these books belong. Some regard them as representative of a specific type of ancient biography, like we have in Mark. Mark is basically a passion narrative, okay, of Jesus with an introduction. Yeah. And this is the very words of the late professor from Yale, Dale Martin. Okay, so scholarly opinion varies about the type of literature to which these books belong. Some regard them as representative of specific type of ancient biography, while at an opposite pole, others regards the gospel form other regards the gospel form as a new and distinctive Christian. Okay, I think there's some mistake here in the writings. There were diverse types of biographies in the Greco-Roman world for which praise of the subject was characteristic, and a citizen of that world who came upon our Gospels probably would have understood them in the context of ancient biographical literature, like we found in the Romans. Okay, we have a lot of early biographies written by the Romans. Other books with the word gospel in their titles circulated among early Christians, some similar in type to the canonical form. Canonical basically means they have been put together, canon from the Greek word, okay, which we have in our New Testament. Okay. Some quite different in form. For example, we have a lot of other gospels which did not make the New Testament, which I have here. Okay, apocryphal gospels. This is published by Oxford University. And this book here. Yeah. It has 40 different gospels and acts in here. For example, we have Gospel of Thomas, Proto Gospel of James, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Okay, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Thomas is different. Okay, and then we have the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew, okay, the Infancy Gospels. We have a lot of Infancy Gospels, the Latin Infancy Gospels. Okay, we have the Jewish Christian Gospels. Okay, and let me turn to Acts. For example, we have the Gospel of Nicodemus, we have the Acts of Pilate, okay, and so on and so forth. Okay. So these literatures, if you do not have it, I will recommend. You can get a different version. This is the one of the versions, and you can get a soft cover version, which is definitely cheaper than this, and it has how do I say it? It has a painting of a person in the ancient Christian art painting. Okay, whereas the dust jacket for this one doesn't have any pictures. Right, so they are, just so that you're aware, Oxford University publishes two different kinds of versions, and I would recommend you getting the other one because it is relatively much cheaper. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John bear a general resemblance to each other is clear. Okay. All are developed narratives which culminate in passion and resurrection accounts. They agree in beginning their story of Jesus' public career with the activity of John the Baptist. Okay, we have all this in our Gospels. John the Baptist appears in all the Gospels, even the Gospel of John, in the prologue as well. Between the Baptist's appearance and the Passion, they relate encounters, mighty deeds, and teachings. Okay, throughout the Gospel, the four Gospel is very unanimous in this, whereby Jesus actually preached. That is the ministry of Jesus. Okay. Such similarities suggest that these books are connected. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so closely related that they are usually regarded as being interdependent. There are many different theories. The more commonly used theories today is that there are two different kinds of sources. Okay, the Markan sources as well as the Q sources. The Markan sources is independent of the Q sources until much later, whereby Matthew and Luke, which came from the Q sources, or actually they have access to the same Q documents, which is why we have a lot of similarities between the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. And then Matthew and Luke also uses the Gospel of Mark, which is why we have narratives in the Gospel of Mark that are also found in Matthew and Luke. So Matthew, for example, contains 90% of Mark. And Luke, for example, contains 60 to 70% of Mark as well. And what doesn't have, and what is there in Matthew and Luke that is not found in Mark, is in Matthew we have Sermon on the Mount, as well as we have the infancy narratives, okay, the childhood narratives of Jesus, not childhood, the first 2 years of the life of Jesus, okay, when he was born. However, in spite of the general resemblances mentioned above, there are also significant variances which separate John from the others. The Gospel of John is completely separate tradition. Okay. Although there are arguments and it is still an ongoing debate, how much do John, the author of John, actually knows the sources that both Matthew, Mark, and Luke uses? John's stories of wondrous deeds are largely different stories and appear to serve a different purpose. John presents Jesus' teaching in extended thematic discourses, in contrast to the collections of saying and parables which characterize the other Gospels. In John, Jesus' ministry oscillates between Galilee and Jerusalem, okay, meaning the ministry of Jesus is back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem. While in the other Gospels, for example, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay, the ministry is concentrated in Galilee until one fateful journey to Jerusalem at its close. Most scholars believe that though certain common traditions lie behind the four Gospels, John is best understood as basically independent of the others. Okay, and this is still the dominant opinion among scholars today. For Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the similarities are pronounced. As I mentioned, there are a lot of similarities, especially percentage-wise. The narrative outlines hang on the same events reported in essentially the same order. So close are these three Gospels to each other that they are commonly called synoptic Gospels, meaning they can be put together. Okay? Or they see, or they share a lot of similarities. They see eye to eye. They see each other, so on and so forth. A useful tool for understanding these Gospels is a synopsis. Okay, a book in which Matthew, Mark, and Luke are each printed in its own order, but in a parallel column format which reveals the unified outline they possess. In fact, the agreement between the synoptic is such as to be explicable only in terms of a literary relationship, okay, just in writings. When documents are said to have a literary relationship, that means that one has used the other as a source or that they have used a common source, which I've explained earlier. The assertion of dependence between Gospels is not made lightly or arbitrarily, but only when a very specific circumstances are present. Literary relationship is not demonstrated merely by the author's knowledge of some of the same stories or by coincidence in general arrangement of materials. Okay. On the contrary, what is minimally required is the recordings of a significant number of passages. Okay. So basically, it goes on and explain, okay, what can be considered as similarities, and obviously differences are something that is not there to begin with between each other. For example, in John, for example, the signs of Jesus raising the dead is not found anywhere, okay, within the synoptics, within Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is clearly literary, but it is also complicated. Not only are there compelling agreements which must be recognized, but occasionally there are divergences in order, in appearance, so on and so forth. Okay. So to explain, to give you, because the author did not actually indicate the examples. So for example, in Matthew and Luke's infancy narratives, okay, did Jesus go to Egypt or did Jesus not go in Egypt? Okay, so in Matthew's gospel, Jesus went to Egypt. But in Luke's gospel, Jesus did not go to Egypt. So which is which? Did Jesus go to Egypt or did Jesus not go to Egypt? Another differences is, for example, towards the end, Luke chapter 4. Okay, between Luke chapter 3 and chapter 4, chapter 1 all the way to chapter 3, Jesus has never been to Galilee. Okay, Jesus is still in Jerusalem. They're not in Galilee. But as we get to, I think, around verse 12 or so of chapter 4, yeah, the passage is that it implies that Jesus has been to Galilee, because the people in the synagogues, they're asking Jesus to show some signs which he has shown in Galilee when he was in Galilee. But the narrative is that Jesus has never been to Galilee. Yeah. So even though we are comparing gospels, okay, but this literary seams basically means there are disconnect between the passages and the narratives in the gospel itself. It's evidence that there are sources being used, there are different sources, and it is also evidence that these sources used to be separate or independent of each other, and then later editor, also known as a redactor, okay, they piece these two narrative together into the gospel we have today called Luke. And so even though we are comparing gospels, the differences between the narratives in the gospels, but if we go deeper, we can also see the differences between the sources being used from the same gospel. And so the rest of the sayings, the rest of the writings here, I can basically explain, and I've already explained because it talks about the Q, the two documentary hypothesis, so on and so forth, which I have explained. Okay. And so now basically I like to share with you something. Let's bring it back to the Quran. Okay. In Surah Ma'idah, it is mentioned that Jesus actually made birds of clay. Okay. But this is actually not found anywhere. Okay. Anywhere in the Gospels. And so for the longest period of time, there are people who claim that the Quran is actually wrong with the stories with regards to Jesus, because there's no such thing as Jesus making birds of clay, from clay, and breathe into it, and it became alive and it flew. Okay, so we have to go to the Apocrypha here, which is why I have this book handy. Okay. We do have in Gospel of John, we do have Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Okay, and this is also mentioned in Surah Ma'idah. Okay, so this is from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Okay, this is chapter 2. Jesus makes sparrows on the Sabbath. Okay, the Shabbat. When this child Jesus was 5 years old, he was playing by the ford of a stream, and he gathered the flowing waters into pools and made them instantly pure. Okay, this is also another miracle that Jesus has been deemed, okay, even though the Quran never confirms this. Okay. These things he ordered simply by speaking a word. He then made some soft mud and fashioned 12 sparrows from it. It was the Sabbath when he did this. Okay. And so Jesus makes sparrows. When a certain Jew saw what Jesus was doing while playing on the Sabbath, he left right away and reported to his father, Joseph. Look, your child is at the stream, and he has taken mud and formed 12 sparrows. He has profaned the Sabbath, because one must not work in the Sabbath. Yeah. When Joseph came to the place and looked, he cried out to him, "Why are you doing what is forbidden on the Sabbath?" But Jesus clapped his hands and cried to the sparrows, "Be gone." And the sparrows took flight and went off chirping. What a beautiful story. Yeah. When the Jews saw this, they were amazed, and they went away and reported to their leaders what they had seen Jesus do. And so even though the details are being described here, Allahu Alam, whether it is true or not, we do not know. Okay. But if you look at early Christian paintings, okay, early Christian paintings in the catacombs, so on and so forth, you do have a depiction of Jesus making sparrows. Okay, Jesus making birds from clay. And this is mentioned in the Quran. Now, if we follow what the Orientalists used to say, okay, in the 19th, 20th century, or even what some apologists, Christian apologists used to say, whereby the Quran actually copies from the New Testament. Okay. Why is there details that is found in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is part of the apocryphal Gospels, or part of the apocryphal literature which were only discovered in the 20th century? So why did the Quran mention this? How could the Prophet ﷺ know about this? When if the Quran actually copies directly from the Bible, and these stories of Jesus making birds of clay is actually not found in the Bible. It is found in the apocryphal book, which is only discovered in the 20th century. How could the Prophet ﷺ know about this? And what evidence is there? This actually is evidence against the claim from apologists that the Prophet actually copied from the Bible. Okay. And so I thought this is some caveat that is worth sharing, because the argument that has been put out there by Christian apologists and missionaries that the Prophet ﷺ actually copied from the Bible. There are many evidence which I can go on. We can talk about the use of the word Malik and the word Pharaoh in the story, in the narrative of Yusuf alayhi salam, Joseph. Okay. And so we can talk about a lot of these different things, but just this one example, yeah, I believe this dismantles the argument that has been put out there that the Prophet actually copies from the Bible, blatantly copies. And so a lot more could be said, and I've made 200 videos or more regarding this topic. These topics, not basically this, but a lot of topics around this. And if you're new to the channel, thank you so much for watching, for exploring and checking things out. Hopefully the content benefits you. And so I'll see you in my next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.